All right, I already began recording. Does everybody see the little recording dot on their screen? Give me like a thumbs up or something, or a wave. Thank you to my co-host. We'll get started in less than a minute. Thank you all for being here, sharing this time with us.
Recording in progress.
Yeah, they just definitely monitor it between that time period. They monitor it, I guess they do have a home visits in regards to it, and it's 90.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here with us today. This session is called Learning from the Historical African American Pedagogical Models. I am the person on record for this presentation, Dr. Amber Jones, but I've also invited my friend and colleague, Dr. Warren-Grice, to be part of this conversation. This was kind of our plan from the beginning, though it just fully came together in the last few days, that we wanted to have more of a conversational presentation. So as we go through, we're going to talk a little bit about like what we mean when we talk about the historical African American pedagogical model and the different models that we draw from and the sources that we draw from. But we really wanted this to be more conversational. So we also built in times to ask you guys questions and hear back from all of the wonderful educators and stakeholders that we have with us today, because we really enjoy this community and all of the great things we can get out of it. And so, because I know I'm a person, I love talking. My colleague I have with me loves talking. So let's go ahead and get started. So leading our discussion today, I already introduced myself a little bit. I'm Dr. Amber Jones. I am an assistant professor of educational studies and psychology at Harris-Stowe State University. And I'll go ahead and, April, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. April Warren-Grice. And I am the founder and CEO of Liberated Genius. I'm a lecturer at Washington University in St. Louis and a research associate at University of Pittsburgh. I'm out here in these streets working for the future and the present day and the past of Black education. I think that'll be enough for today, for now, and then we can talk a little bit more later.
Yes, and so, one of us got a mute, thank you. So Dr. Warren-Grice and I we have been colleagues for a while. I think you might have to mute. Sorry. All right. We've been colleagues for a long time. In general, because we have this deep interest and love for the history of Black education. And so we thought it would be really great to have this discussion today. And when we came together to talk about how we want to have this discussion, how we want to engage with this community when we think about the history of Black education, we came up with like these three main buckets we wanted to talk about. And that is what we lost when it comes to Black education, what we maintain when it comes to Black education and pedagogy, and also what we can go back and fetch. What can we take from that history and make new and rebuild? And so those are like the three main categories we want to talk about today. All right. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we lost. And so some of the people, I see some of the names here might know me as your professor who loves talking about this history. Some of you may not know me or be familiar with my research, but in general, I'm someone who really fell in love with the story of Black education. And there are so many things in the story that I think inform who we are today and what is important. And so when I fell in love with the story of Black education, I ended up thinking a lot about what we lost, and I kind of wanted to lay a foundation of what I'm talking about when I say like what we lost in this study of Black education. One of the most impactful things that I think of is just the memories of our educational culture as a people, as a class of people, as African Americans. When I think about the memories of our educational culture, I think about the Sankofa symbol, which you can see in this picture I included here, where, long story short, these Sankofa symbols that are Adinkra symbols from Western Africa. Among many other things, they were put here by enslaved Africans that knew this language, knew this symbol, knew that it essentially meant, don't forget we were here, reach back and take the history that we're leaving here. And of all of the great things of that story, I really think of, for the context of this conversation, is to show that as people who are descended from enslaved peoples, that our people came here with literate cultures that they spread throughout our country that we can see in these Sankofa symbols. Along with that, I also think about the history of slave revolts and anti-literacy laws. People might know in the history about certain famous slave revolts like the Stoner Rebellion that were led by literate slaves and organized by literate slaves. And in direct relation to the backlash from those slave results, we got anti-literacy laws. And so I see that as another important part of our educational culture, is to understand what it means to be part of a class of people who were barred from learning to read and write. Out of that, we can connect with other educational values that have to do with how enslaved people literally learned to steal an education because they were barred from learning to read and write. I could talk all day about the stories of enslaved people who were able to steal away into a cave and join a makeshift native school ran by other enslaved people or free people of color. I could talk all day about the people who stole away in ditches in order to have some time to read their books, or who would trade food in order to get some lessons on how to read and write and figure numbers. These are all very powerful parts of our educational culture that, through the process of history, through specific choices, that a lot of these memories get lost. And I think that those are important to take into mind, because then they inform so many other important parts of our history. I talk a lot about our organizational history and the advocacy of Black teacher organizations that directly came out of these ethics that came from enslaved people having to steal an education, that the same people that were willing to risk their lives, risk their livelihoods in order to get an education, because they knew that it could lead to freedom and it could lead to more self-determination, On the other side of the Civil War, you see them creating their teacher organizations. You see them creating a system of education for Black children that espouse those values and espouse the value of having control over their own education. Part of what we've lost in the history, or what is not as openly understood, is all of the works of the Black teacher organizations, of developing the pedagogical excellence that produced the great thinkers of our big C, big R civil rights movement. That you can draw a direct connection between the kind of education and the values that were espoused in segregated schools that were run by Black professionals that had generated this pedagogical excellence for Black children. You can draw a direct connection between those schools and the people that would become our intellectual leaders in the civil rights movement. That is all on purpose. That you can see in our history, and it's important to reclaim. And then lastly, what I think is important to think about in the historical experiences of African Americans is these perspectives on equity post-Brown, where in the dominant narrative, we're all taught a little bit about Brown, enough about Brown, that it was this important civil rights victory, and reversed some or supposedly reversed certain thinking that really came to shape education for our people. But another thing that I think that is lost in the history, that we're not taught as much, is in the victory of Brown, also the losses that came with the losses of our Black teachers organizations being absorbed and losing the positions of power that they had in order to advocate for Black children, in order to advocate for that pedagogical excellence that was developed for Black children. And so it's important to be able to have those perspectives on what was lost when we think about the context of what was gained with Brown. I'm not one who will sit here and ever argue that Brown was a bad thing, but I will argue that these perspectives are very important. You might notice in the slide, I do have some good sources for some of the points that I'm making. I am going to put a link to this presentation in the chat for everybody so that you can go back to these sources and kind of pick up the different points that I've talked about. Is there anything you want to add on the what we've lost part of it, Dr. Warren-Grice?
I think part of what we lost is a sincere urgency. Not that it's not relevant today, because everybody on the equity bandwagon, everybody on the equity band trip, and yeah, let's fight for equity. Yeah, let's do this. All right, let's do it. And we are trying, right? But the urgency when we were enslaved people, when Black folks were enslaved people, the urgency was a different matter. And it really literally was, quite frankly, a matter of life and death. And not that there's not similarities and parallels today, because I mean, if we look at all the attacks on critical race theory, which, as we know, nobody's teaching in grade schools or elementary schools or high schools or anything, there have been attacks and people could potentially lose their jobs. And there have probably been some death threats, but the rampant amount of, but the real, how do I say, the threat of death is not as pervasive, right? It's actually a slow death. I mean, that's really what it is, like microaggressions, like cut with like 1,000 pieces, what do they call it, with a paper cut, right? So that's it's a different kind of death. But I think that urgency that we had during that time and under Jim Crow was just a bit different. And it really was, people move with urgency. And as Sonia Sanchez says, like, how does this free us? Like, everything was for how does this free us? Again, how does it free us? Sonia Sanchez said, how does this free? Yes, but how does this free us? So everything moved with that purpose, but how does this free us? And I'm going to keep repeating that. You'll probably hear me talk about that all throughout this, because if it doesn't go back to, yes, but how does this free us? Because if it only frees a certain amount of people, then it's not good enough. But how does this free us? That's the urgency they acted on. And I think that was one of the things that we lost, because, we got comfortable with this thing called desegregation. I mean, not that we're comfortable, but we're a little comfortable because we done made it a little bit, right? Because we can go to this nice school, we can live in this nice neighborhood, right? Right? And so there's a level of comfort, and people aren't willing to risk what it takes. So friend and colleague, Dr. Bettina Love talks about, like, being an abolitionist educator, right? Because you have to be willing to give up something, to lose some amount of comfort, but like, who is really willing to do that? And I think that's what those educators were doing. I'm gonna pause here, because like I can keep going on and on, like Erykah Badu said. All right, let's go.
I think that's a perfect transition to this next part, because I did put together some just examples to talk about, and we are going to go to you guys and ask your opinions and your feedback on what we've said so far. But here are just two quotes I pulled out to help illustrate what we're talking about when we talk about what we've lost in terms of looking at the history of Black education. This first one is from one of my favorite profiles of a segregated school during de jure segregation. It's from a book called A Traditional Model of Educational Excellence. No, it is not by me, Jones. I wish I was that Jones, but not quite there in my career yet. But here is just a quote that I always find inspiring. And this is talking about a segregated school where led by people who are part of these Black teacher organizations, as I was talking about, well-versed in this pedagogical excellence for African Americans that was cultivated in the Black teacher organizations. So here's one of the findings from this study of the school. It says the most striking and important finding in the study is the synergism among the community, parents, administrators, teachers, and students of Dunbar. That's the name of the school. This was Dunbar High School in DC. I know that St. Louis has our own Dunbar school, so just a little context there. The next most striking finding is that educational aspirations and attainment of young Blacks are not circumscribed by the educational attainment of their parents. I love this quote because it's so powerful when you think about it and compare to the schools we are part of now. And like, can we say this? Can we say that there is that synergism between the community, parents, administrators, teachers, and students? Can we say that the educational aspirations of Black children in these schools today is not determined or circumscribed by the educational attainment of their parents? I think that's so powerful and something that was not uncommon in our Black schools and our segregated schools. And so like, just hold your thoughts on that. I'm sure you have some great thoughts on that quote. Next, I want to talk about this quote, and this was taken from a speech given by Dr. Horace Tate, who is one of the leaders of one of these Black organizations that I mentioned that helped cultivate the kind of school that we just read about at Dunbar School here. And here is from a speech that he gave after they had to vote to dissolve their Black teacher organization to join the white teacher organization for desegregation. So Dr. Tate says that what is dangerous with the kind of integration that they were proposing, I'm given kind of a background here. He's saying second-class integration is evil, because it's designed to steal from the Negro boy or girl that Black image which has motivated boys and girls and made them to roll up their sleeves and carve out a new role for what we call democracy in this country. Second-class integration is evil because it's designed to make the Negro feel he is not good enough or trained enough or qualified enough to be the head of anything with which whites are involved. Second-class integration is evil because it does not consider the desire, the customs, the mores, the traditions, or feelings of Black people as important in the scheme of our society. There can be no first-class citizenship with second-class integration. I say to you again, second-class integration is evil. And so what Tate is saying here is we're going from a system where we had synergism, we had found a way to get more educational opportunities and aspirations for children than what their parents had. And we can't trade that for a system that doesn't incorporate all of the good things that got us there, that doesn't incorporate those positive Black images, that doesn't incorporate the customs and the cultures and the values of Black communities and what we bring into a classroom. So those are just like two really powerful quotes that I pulled out to kind of illustrate this idea of what we lost. And so now now we want to hear back from you. Feel free, we have a few people in our session, which is awesome. So I'm trying to think of how we should organize this. Dr. Warren-Grice, do you have an idea?
How many people do we have? We have 46 people.
Which is
How
a
about
blessing.
this?
Thank you for joining us.
Right. I mean, y'all wanted to hear something, huh? All right. And we appreciate that. What impact does reclaiming this history have? If we can have just folks marinate on that for a moment and then just drop something in the chat, and then we'll just kind of read off a little bit. And, you know, I can start actually, but I'm going to practice my wait time, right? But what impact does reclaiming this history have, you know? Take a few moments and just drop something in the chat.
I do it.
Yes? Because as one of my Jegnas likes to say, Dr. Greg Carr from Howard University, he says there are 3 texts. He says, can you mute your phone? Thank you. He says there are 3 texts. There's the professor or the instructor, the one that is standing before you. There is the text itself, and then there is you. We all bring our experiences and we engage with that text, right? And so we are all texts here. And so we want to engage together. So in answering that question, I'm going to give us just a couple minutes to really engage that question. What impact does reclaiming this history have? And then we'll, open it up for a little bit, and then we'll jump back into the presentation.
So thank you to Elizabeth Mobley, adding that this gives perspective that our substance and innate being is incredible, and in that our self-esteem can grow and we can contribute and encourage others to grow. I agree. At one point, I wanted to include this quote, but forgot to in the final edit of this presentation. But there's a wonderful quote by Akbar that talks about how it's so important for us to be able to see, and by us talking about Black children, Black people, to be able to see images of our own excellence, not just in like very individualized ways. Like Serena Williams, she's amazing. She's also like probably one of the best athletes to ever live. And she's an amazing person to talk about, but it's important to see our excellence even in the more common variety, the common excellence, to see also how we contributed to this world that we live in. That is so important. And when it's something that we've lost, that has a big impact on us. Thank you. There's more people adding, helps our students see and value their identity. I agree. It brings up a sense of pride for our students. It is empowering for students to know that being a teacher and an educator is part of our cultural legacy. This could have a great impact in recruiting more educators of color. I agree. It could also create a liberator mindset for their education and criticality that can set a purpose for learning. Ooh, I love it. Snaps.
Let me jump in real quick with that point. Sharif El-Mekki, he's out in Philadelphia. He has the Black Educator Center, the Center for Black Educator Development. And he really emphasizes this point and just that it's a part of our legacy. Like, I think this is like, it's so interesting when schools talk about, yeah, we need to recruit more Black educators. We need to recruit more educators of color. And I'm like, well, we had a whole bunch, right? Like, as opposed to addressing this symptom, we need to actually address the root, right? Like, how did we get here, right? And so in doing that, like, if we remind students, remind them that this is actually like, this is real work. Like, this is like soldier work to do this work, and that it's a part of our legacy in order to get here. Like, we got here as in making the progress that we had, mostly, that might be an overstatement, but it might not be. Mostly by those educators that were doing the work. Dr. Jones was talking about, she mentioned Horace Tate. And in the book, The Lost Education of Horace Tate, I was about to pull it up, there it is. This book right here, if you don't have it, I suggest you get into it, by Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker. She describes how there were these networks that they had, and they worked at every level. So principals worked with teachers and worked with their parents to really work with the NAACP to actually make movement for Brown versus Board of Education. Like, if it wasn't for those principals that found the parents and the families that could serve as that could serve in that case, then we wouldn't have had a case to begin with, right? And so it really took some strategic training. It took some maneuvering and negotiating and navigating that space. And so if we teach our students, like, this is where it's at, being an educator, then we can actually increase that teacher pipeline again, which again, I mentioned Sharif El-Mekki because he's doing such a great job with that, but it can start right here. Yeah, it can start right here.
I want to highlight, thank you, Ms. Charlotte, for sharing your story, saying that having grown up during Jim Crow, I grapple with what I lost when integration started. When we weren't integrated, I lived in a village. My teachers were my Sunday school teachers. They invested in me. I didn't know anything about an achievement gap. I knew I could be or do anything I wanted to do. I belonged. We lost thousands of Black teachers who were innovative and found anything to teach us from. We lost a lot. Yes, I want to echo that. In the research, it cites that we've lost between 30 and 50,000 Black educators with desegregation. And when I hear numbers like that, and that's across the South, I hear a whole generation of innovation, of pedagogy that was just removed. And go ahead, Dr. Warren-Grice, and then I want to move forward because some of the things you're talking about, we do have questions for. So thank you for your awesome engagement. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I got a slow down. I have a quote from Carter G. Woodson. We're in February, Black History Month, father of Black History Month. And in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, he states, to handicap a student by teaching him that his Black face is a curse and that his struggle to change his condition is hopeless is the worst sort of lynching. It kills one's aspirations and dooms him to vagabondage and crime. It is strange then that friends of truth and the promoters of freedom have not risen up against the present propaganda in the schools and crushed it. This crusade is much more important than the anti-lynching movement because there would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom. I highlight that because what's happened when we lost those educators is that we got this miseducation. And Black students continue to get the miseducation. Really, all students continue to get the miseducation. And so if we don't address that miseducation, getting to the root of it, then again, we will just be like trying to attack little surface issues and trying to attack symptoms. But Dr. Jones wants me to go on, so I'm gonna go on. But miseducation of the Negro, I highly suggest we get into that. And W.E.B. Du Bois, he once gave this talk about, you know, the color line, right? And we all know that the souls of Black folks and the veil and stuff. But he said, you know, the real truth is gonna be like, what's happened, like, what happens after we get this desegregation?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we find ourselves today. So I think
Yes,
that
is a
segue.
perfect transition. Thank you for everybody. I really wanted to get to your comment, Jarius, and I'm gonna find a way to, but we're gonna move forward. And so we're gonna go through this one even faster. So we knew that when we're talking about this, this history of Black education, that not everything was lost though. You know, like one, just all of us are here. I love the stories that I can just like read part of that you're sharing with us in the chat, but there are parts of our work that survive and thrive. And I wanted us to get a chance to talk a little bit about how we're maintaining some of that culture and some of those values.
I don't have $300.
So do you want to go first?
Yes. Dr. Patricia, thank you. All right, so what we maintain. So for my dissertation, I did this dissertation where I focused on Black educators in predominantly white schools. And I was like, man, they're really doing some work. And this is, you know, this is when I first came out of teaching as a high school English teacher and then went to graduate school. And I was like, man, they're doing some work. They're doing something magical here. And then I learned about this thing called culturally relevant pedagogy by Dr. Laura Lassen-Billings, who was my academic grandmother. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is it. Where, you know, you use culture as a bridge to academic excellence. You use it for socio-political consciousness, like basically, how does this free us? If we're not talking about this, if we're not talking about issues that can work to free us, then like, what are we talking about it for? We use all of these, and I was just like, culturally relevant pedagogy, that's it. Wow, like that's, and then when I looked at it even further to do, because I had to do my literature review on it, I was like, wait a minute. This is what Black educators been doing all along. I mean, whether they were in predominantly white suburban schools, which is what my dissertation focused on, or whether they were in urban schools. So Charlotte EJ was talking about how she grew up in that with those educators. This is what they practice. When I talk to older Black educators and they express like how they like love going to school because their teachers love them and the way that they engage. Culturally relevant pedagogy is what Black educators been doing. We've been doing that since before, right? And then I mentioned abolitionist pedagogy before, Dr. Bettina Love. She talks about like, we have to be willing to put something on the line, right? And abolitionist pedagogy talks about like putting something on the line, but doing it again so it frees us. And not just some of us, but all of us, right? Abolitionist pedagogy. And there she talks, and Bettina talks about how anybody, just like Lassen-Billings, can use culturally relevant pedagogy and can practice abolitionist pedagogy. Fugitive pedagogy, very similar. And in fugitive pedagogy, some might say that, well, why we gotta call it fugitive pedagogy, right? Because what they were doing, it was fugitive to some folks, to white folks who were like, hey, you shouldn't be doing it. But to Black folks in general, this answered the question, how does this free us? Again, all of this work, what Black educators have been doing, one of the sincerest values is it's an effort for freedom and liberation. And I use those two words separately because freedom, okay, chains, they're no longer on us, right? Okay, we got like, okay, we're not segregated by law anymore, right? But we are free, right? But it is until we act on that freedom. Liberation, that's like a state of being, a state of mind and how we act. And so that's what they were teaching for us to be free and to be liberated, to act like we free. Because a lot of times we don't act like we free. And a lot of times, even in the classroom, we have educators and, yeah, I want to do this, but oh, I can't do it, right? And people are scared to actually practice abolitionist pedagogy because, well, I don't know, because losing your job is, that's serious, right? And some folks have been threatened. Even in my dissertation, I remember one of my participants, she said, who's gonna read this work? I did my dissertation in 2014. She said, who is going to read this work? Because she was scared that her job was on the line. Another participant, she said, and she was a retired educator, she was a counselor, but she said, when I was doing this work, she was practicing abolitionist pedagogy without the name, practicing culturally relevant pedagogy without the name. When she was doing this work, she said her job was threatened until she, came up with the receipts and had to show people. But job safety is, it's real. And so that is the thing that we maintain. We maintain this effort for acting along the lines of how does this free us? When we close the doors and we like, okay, I know what they said, and yes, we still need to do this, because how does this free us? I want to get to some of our work, Grow Your Own. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes. When we were thinking about what we maintain of this culture, what we learn from Black teachers during de jure segregation, and we wanted to talk a little bit about how we incorporated this into the work that we do. I'm going to go through this real quickly because I want us to have more time to talk to each other. I run a Grow Your Own program where, like, literally, as one of our comments suggested, I'm looking to recruit more people to be teachers using this history, this is part of our legacy. This is part of our cultural identity even. That education is part of what binds African-American experience together. And wanting to use these stories in order to do that, that is definitely underway. Along those same lines, I just started a Mentors of Color Matter program where I'm connecting some of our pre-service teachers of color with mentors of color. Our pilot program is first with the Kirkwood School District that we've put together, but we're using, culturally relevant mentoring. We're using the values from these Black schools, from African-American pedagogy in order to mentor these pre-service teachers, again, to try to get at some of what has been lost.
Two of the programs that I'm working on with Liberated Genius, one, I did some work with the National Equity Project where I provided the landscape for racial affinity groups as well. So educators of color and how they are working together to support students of color. My second project that I'm currently working on is I'm working with the University of Pittsburgh, and we're focusing on this project called focusing on the future of Black education. And so we are doing just that synergy work that Dr. Tate and Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker talked about in their book, or in her book, when she was talking about bringing all of those folks, all the stakeholders together to really address the issues that Black students are facing. And so that's actually what we're doing at the University of Pittsburgh. And with that work, we're hoping to really create conversations with people all over the area, the region, the United States, as well as even the international. And let's get to some conversation, Dr. Jones.
All right. So our question to you is, how are you continuing the legacy? We have some really amazing people in our audience. And if you see ways that you are kind of taking these values that you can connect to historical African-American experiences in education, we want to hear about it. How are you continuing the legacy?
And we want to drop some in the chat, but then we also want to just be able to call on a few folks. So if you want to, just because there's so many people in this group, if you want, just raise your hand. Can we stop sharing the screen? That way we can see the folks.
Sure.
So we can drop something in the chat, and then we can call on folks to talk about what you're doing to preserve that legacy that Black teachers, Black educators have always had.
Just to put them on the spot, I see some of my mentor of color scholars in here. If one of you want to be brave and just like give us your thoughts, how do you see yourself as part of this legacy of Black education based on what you've learned about Black educators? Pretend I'm looking right at you, my students.
I can share. For me, this just made me reflect just on my family's history. I've been blessed to come from a strong family of educators. My great grandmother was a special education teacher. My mom is currently a teacher as well. And, for me, I didn't really plan on like being in the realm of higher ed. But I'm just glad that I can, just have my influence to where I work in Lindenwood University as the program manager of Fraternity and Sorority Life. But just having people see me in that role, knowing that they can achieve their goals and know that it's possible. For me being a young student, in the St. Louis public schools, some students, some teachers I didn't see look like me, in some places. So again, that's having that influence, encouragement, and then taking that going on to a HBCU where we kind of like wrapped around a little bit everything that we kind of touched today as well from a whole perspective. It just really feels good to be a part of, but something I don't take with a grain of salt because we are needed in our spaces. And most importantly, to just not just look at it as it's just another everyday job, but the purpose and the mission and the passion that we have to really inflict change and really develop our young students as the next leaders, in the world as well. So that's what I want to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share on how are you continuing this legacy? How does it connect with you as we have this conversation?
I think sorry, I don't know how I would not continue this legacy. It's just that important to me. And I've worked a long time in education. I value it, the kids, I love the kids. And I still, even when I got to the district level and, came out of a building, I still worked with kids as groups of girls and individually across the district in Parkway, because they are the reason I do what I do. And they're the reason when someone's talking about when you almost got fired. Well, there were several times I almost got fired because of what I was teaching, what I was doing. Especially when you're looking at diversity and equity. When you're looking at equity, period, and you're pointing out inequity, your job's always going to be on the line. But at the same time, I will never stop doing this work. I've got 2 grandsons now that I've got to watch over and ensure that they're treating them well, because they have, their father is dead. He died in a car accident when Juan was 6 months and my daughter was 4 months pregnant with the second one. Thank God for that. And so I have to make sure that we continue to do this work. And I really don't want anyone to shy away from inequity and calling it out. I can't, I see this as my calling, not just my work. I had amazing teachers in my segregated school. I miss that. I think segregation literally did a thing to us. I really believe that. Yes, maybe we gained some momentum, but at the same time, if things had been equitable, we wouldn't have had to split apart. I mean, or come together in order to get those things. So I truly, truly miss that. And so we lost thousands and thousands of teachers because they got a chance, our Black teachers, great Black teachers, got a chance to, the parents got a chance, white parents got a chance to say whether or not they wanted to be taught by a Black teacher. So if they didn't, you didn't have a job. You may have been a janitor, or these are teachers that had masters, PhDs, and everything else. So this is not something any of us can shy away from. I will be doing this the rest of my life.
Thank you. That was so
The fight for it.
powerful.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry for cutting you off.
No, that's okay.
Charlotte. Thank you. That was so powerful. Talking about how like this is a calling and you kind of don't have a choice to continue this legacy. I want to highlight Miss Elizabeth Mobley's has shared some really great experiences on how they continue this legacy. I'm the only Black educator in a coordinator's position in my K-12 system. I've been able to positively change the narrative of Black students. That's so important, and you see that in the history of Black teachers too, that like there's a big difference between looking at a student and believing in all of their potential versus looking at a student and only seeing a certain stereotype or only seeing what you think they're capable of. So continue that. And to positively change the narrative of Black students and Black leadership, and how we have great capacity for learning and producing beauty and intellect. Additionally, I've been able to help my Black students identify their Blackness as power and grace, and there are incredible ways to embrace it and walk in their destiny. Their white classmates create an environment where they feel less than, but when I work with them and tell them all I do, they have a deeper belief of all they can do. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. There's more saying, although this is my last semester teaching, I'll be using my experience as a Black educator in the world of user research as it relates to ed tech products. Awesome. I'm always asking myself, how can we use technology to make sure we are represented in product development? And I desire to use tech to create equity in the space of education. Excellent. Additionally, we see my organization, this is from Ms. Kelly Bird. Love for Literacy continues this legacy by giving Black children new Black children's picture books, so they are able to see themselves in the literature that they read. Excellent. I see all of this as aligning with some of the work of Black educators. And I think that brings us to our last part, and I think we still have a chance of finishing this with a good amount of time to talk. Give me one moment to share my screen again. Dr. Warren-Grice, will you share what was just posted in the chat while I bring this up? Oh, you're still on mute.
Yeah, of course. You got to at least do it one time.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a bit. Joshua Hunter is a part of the legacy. I have made it my responsibility to ensure that students who look like me and come from similar Black backgrounds know that they are represented. I have worked with young Black children who grow up in predominantly white areas, and they tend to feel like an outsider. I want them to know that they are just as impactful as anyone else and to never forget that. Kayla Harris, being the only Black educator in my department at my previous institution, helped me understand that my work is never done, never, when it comes to continuing the legacy. I made it my mission to get to know most, if not all, the Black residents on campus and getting to know their stories. I want them to know that they are heard in high-level departments and have the right to bring any issues they have. I've been able to change the narrative of my department and how they interact with students on campus.
Thank you so much. I think this brings us to just this last question we have of just like what we can reach back and fetch that I think we can see even just in this session amongst these people. There are so many ways that we're taking the values of Black teachers into our own classroom and recreating some of what they had. And I think some things that we can reach back and fetch with this value of Sankofa is looking more at the professionalism of Black teachers that I wish, we had several more hours to talk more about how Black teacher organizations supported Black teacher professionalism and think about ways we can continue those legacies and recreate those legacies. There's so many awesome models for looking at how we can recreate the education that we see around us in light of these models, knowing that these models were developed without a deficit model for Black children. And that is such a huge impact on how things are designed. I also think that something that we could continue to recreate is this idea of restorative practice for Black teachers and students that I'm always wondering in the history. I was like, I wonder how those Black teachers also like took care of themselves. Like there's research that talks about like the community caring for itself and who cared for the school and who cared for the students. And I think that one thing that we can be inspired by in the history, but also make for ourselves is this idea of restorative practice for Black teachers and students, taking into account the pressures that we face in this post-COVID era, and all of the ways that our educational system has been changed and has had to adapt in little notice, but also see the potential there in order to, again, reach back and fetch what we had and recreate it for where we are. Dr. Warren-Grice, tell us a little bit about this idea of rebirth, and then we're going to go to our last question.
Okay, great. And can you take the PowerPoint off?
Yes.
So I happen to, I mentioned my JIGNA, my mentor, Dr. Greg Carr from Howard University. And I learned from him the hieroglyph for rebirth. We were talking about Renaissance, and he mentioned, there's actually an earlier iteration of that. Like basically, we think about the origin story of rebirth. And there's a hieroglyph, the meta-nature for rebirth. What it means is, whenever you find your place in a place of trouble, you go back to the last time that you were stuck or in a place of trouble and you came out of it. And you use that as your starting point. Now, when he said that, I promise you it changed my life. I promise you it did, because I now, like literally, whenever I'm like in a moment of like, I don't know what to do, I'm kind of stuck, I think about that and I was like, okay, what did rebirth say? Okay, what did the hieroglyph say? It said, go back to the last time that I was stuck and solved it and use that as my starting point. Like I was blown away. And so if we think about that in terms of Black education, in terms of what the value that Black educators have given us, like Sankofa, we can reach back and fetch it and bring it forth and use that as our starting point. I want to give us a couple of resources while we're here, just because I just pulled them off the shelf while Dr. Amber was talking. But this book by Dr. Michelle Foster, it's called Black Teachers on Teaching. Powerful book right here, powerful book. Like, because too oftentimes my people perish for lack of knowledge. We can just get this from right here, okay? Then if you're really into history and want a thicker book, and this is great too, Dr. James Anderson's book right here. If you are about this life and especially if you call yourself a researcher and you're not citing Dr. Anderson, or Dr. Michelle Foster, you ain't doing something right. But The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935 by Dr. James Anderson. And then I mentioned this one before, The Lost Education of Horace Tate by Vanessa Siddle Walker, Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker. These books right here, they'll just show you just how powerful we are and what we can do to reach back and bring it forward, to use that as a starting point. We don't have to start from scratch, folks. It's already been done. Like legit, it's already been done. All we just got to do is remember, meaning to put back together again. Remember what we've been told.
And since we're picking up books and shouting out, I want to reiterate, like, yes, all of those books that Dr. Warren-Grice just brought up are awesome. Most of them I have linked and cited in the presentation that I put a little link for everybody to get to, so you can find those citations and find them. What I wanted to also highlight amongst the books, I have Dr. Goldie Muhammad's book, who is one of our keynote speakers for the presentation. Hopefully you've been able to see her speak. But I also think that that book is an excellent example of how you can take these historical models, these historical values, and apply them to what we're doing in class today. So Dr. Goldie Muhammad has a really awesome framework for applying she uses historically relevant literacy practice. And so if you are a literacy teacher or any kind of teacher, since we know literacy is important everywhere, I highly recommend looking at those historical examples. And so now we are left with our last question. We got 5 minutes. Is just like, what do you want to build? So looking at how we've talked about the history of Black education, these models that we can draw from, that we do draw from without even fully knowing where they come from. What do you want to build from here?
Hi, I'm Danielle Garrett. I'll go ahead and say something. Personally, what I would like to build is students that really value education and have that value for themselves and for each other. And that could take away from many of the distractions that we have in the classroom when they begin to value themselves and to value each other and to value their education. So that is definitely something on my top priority list, is to build that value for it and appreciation for learning and being okay to fail and push forward during those awkward times, because so many of them have been out of school and they just feel stressed with all the work that they have to do. They feel defeated in some senses because they've been out of school so long that math and reading and everyone is just like back to business, and they're like, business was like 2 years ago and I'm confused with what's going on right now. So, and not to mention any other hardships that they might be dealing with. Definitely instilling a value in not just the students, but also the parents, because many of our parents, as was mentioned before, like yesterday, struggle with education themselves. And so just, allowing them to see that value as well, and so that we can team up, so that we can encourage students to really put the best foot forward.
My question back, thank you for that comment. My question back would be, how do you think we can use the history or engage the history in order to help develop students who really value education, as you were saying? Anybody can jump in.
Hello. I'm sorry I don't have my video on. It's the sound is a little better with it off. My name's Alondra Sutton. I currently work in Hazelwood School Districts. I am a homeschool communicator, which is kind of like a counselor. Previously, I was a special education early childhood teacher, and I wanted to speak to what you just were asking about. So basically, early childhood is the family's first interaction with the school system. What I have found in predominantly Black areas, it has not been a positive experience for parents. So what I've told parents is, this is your child's first experience with the school system. I want it to be a positive one. We are your village. We are here to help you. And just because whether your child ends up with this IEP or any disability, that does not mean that they are incapable of learning. They 100% are. And that's why we're here to help you. Just building that relationship with parents. If you don't have a relationship with parents, it's going to be very hard for you to have these Black students be successful. In my current role, I see kids, mainly kids that may have a lot of trauma in their family background. So when I have to call parents, it is the same thing. I always start off with a positive, something positive about their kid, because they may not be hearing anything positive about their child if they are constantly getting calls about behavior, acting out in class, not turning in homework. So building that with the parents, and having very real conversations with parents. We all want our kids to do better than we did. My parents wanted me to do better. They 100% understand that. You know, just building that connection every time you have that opportunity.
Thank you for that. I want to use this pause because we're right at 5:15. I want to encourage everybody to take in the other awesome presentations that are part of the symposium. I want to thank everybody for coming and being part of our presentation. I put a link, use the link that I just put to the presentation where I have all of the sources that we mentioned. Someone also asked how to have a copy of the recording. That is going to be available on the SBE website. After we're done here, I'm going to download it, send it to them, and they're going to make that available to you all. I wish that we had many more hours in order to fully hash out all these amazing ideas that we shared. But thank you so much for being here with us. I'm going to put my contact information in the chat for you all to also have, and going to encourage my colleague, Dr. April Warren-Grice as well.
Thank you all so much. Continue to do that work, continue this legacy. We see it on some huge shoulders, and it's kind of like we have to do this work. As Charlotte EJ mentioned, we cannot not do this work. Lives are at stake. The greatest trick is to have people to believe that they are not at war when actually we are at war. When a colleague, Dr. Kimmett Shockley from Texas now, when he said that, at first I was like, dang, that was real masculine. And then I was like, dang, no, he's right. This is urgent. We are at war if we are not doing this work for our students. Continue this work. Thank you so much.
Yeah, reach out to us if you're interested in partnering with us on any of the ways we're applying this work. Thank you for being part of it. Enjoy the rest of the symposium.
Peace out. Have a great one. Charlotte, we need a date. Anybody else I've seen and haven't seen, we need a date.